Our next speaker is Keavy Martin. I'm glad to say she's my special colleague from the Department of English and Film Studies. She's an associate professor there in English and Film. Her talk today draws from her Insight Grant funded research and is titled Reconciliation or Treaty Relationships. Keavy.
Well, thank you so much, Sue and the other organizers. Thank you especially to SSHRC. Thanks to all of you for coming. I also want to begin today by acknowledging the nations of Treaty Number 6 and also the Métis and Blackfoot nations whose territory the University of Alberta is located in. There's a lot of buzz these days about reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools, which came to Edmonton in the spring of 2014, is now concluding its work, and it has released a series of 94 calls to action. And across the country, organizations, universities like this one, are trying to think about ways to respond to those calls in order to help remove some of the systemic barriers facing Indigenous peoples in Canada. But one of the challenges that they face is the concept of reconciliation itself. Although the TRC has consistently defined reconciliation as a series of relationships that honor Indigenous rights, many scholars have pointed out a series of flaws with that term. And this is just to give you a few examples. Conversations around reconciliation tend to emphasize the pastness of historical colonization. So for instance, residential schools are imagined to be sort of safely contained in the past. In fact, the last residential schools closed in 1996, but their impacts continue to be felt today, and many would say that other tactics of assimilation, including the child welfare system, are very much ongoing. Another issue in conversations around reconciliation is that they tend to emphasize the need of survivors of residential schools to heal, to forgive, to move on, or even in some cases to get over it, thereby placing the onus on survivors rather than on Canadian society. And perhaps most importantly, the discourse of reconciliation has tended to obscure issues of ongoing colonialism. Canada today, even with a new government, very much needs its natural resources, and in most cases, this struggles when it comes to issues of Indigenous rights. So how do we talk about reconciliation? How do we respond to the calls to action while avoiding these pitfalls? I'm part of a collaborative research project called Creative Conciliations, and we are turning to the work of Indigenous artists to help us think around and beyond reconciliation. On your right, you see Tahltan performance artist Peter Morin. They're pictured with Ayumi Goto and Cheryl Larondel in a performance entitled Hair. And it speaks to the history of residential schools, but also reminds us of the ways that that history creates burdens in the present. And there you see Ayumi Goto tying rocks to Peter Morin's body using strips of prayer cloth. And on the left, you see University of Alberta student Sandy Auger, who created this installation as part of a class project here in Rutherford Library. This was a very provocative piece, and it got a lot of response. At one point, actually, the flag ended up being stolen. But before it disappeared, it forced people to think about the processes by which Indigenous lands became something that we call Canada. And a reminder here that in this territory, the oral history says that these lands were never surrendered. So art has the possibility to provoke us. It can allow us to see the world in different ways. And our research team is very much inspired by these artists. They're helping us to think about ways that we can carry the burdens of history together and the ways in which we can honor our treaty relationships, which have already laid out the ways in which we are supposed to live together in this territory. Thank you.